Late one foggy evening, nestled along a desolate stretch of Route 47, a small diner called Eddie's Eats stood as a beacon of warmth for weary travelers. Its glowing neon sign buzzed faintly, struggling to cut through the dense mist. The place had an odd charm, a throwback to the 1950s with red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a cheery waitress named Linda, who always seemed too happy to be there. Tom, a long-haul trucker, pulled into the gravel lot, grateful for the promise of coffee and a hot meal. As he stepped inside, the diner felt off. The air was heavy, and an acrid metallic scent lingered just beneath the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee. A handful of customers sat scattered throughout, each with their heads bowed low over their meals. None of them looked up when Tom entered. Linda greeted him with her trademark smile, but her eyes seemed distant, almost glassy. "Grab a seat, Han," she said, handing him a laminated menu that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Tom slid into a booth near the window, but the fog outside was so thick he could barely see his own rig. As he looked around, he noticed something peculiar. None of the other diners were eating. Their forks moved mechanically, lifting food to their mouths, but they didn't chew or swallow. They just stared ahead, blankly going through the motions. "Coffee?" Linda asked, startling him. She was already pouring from a stained pot, the liquid blacker and thicker than it should have been. "Sure," Tom muttered, though he suddenly wasn't thirsty. "What's good here?" "Everything," Linda replied, her smile widening unnaturally. "But you should try the special. Everyone loves it." Tom hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but hunger won out. "All right, I'll take the special." As Linda walked away, Tom glanced back at the other patrons. One man in a plaid shirt was staring directly at him now, his mouth slightly open. His eyes were dark and sunken, and his face seemed to twitch unnaturally, as though he were fighting to keep control of it. Tom looked away quickly, gripping his coffee cup for comfort. When Linda returned, she set down a plate of food that looked vaguely like meatloaf, but glistened with an unsettling, oily sheen. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of decay and something chemical. "Dig in," she said cheerfully, her teeth seeming sharper now, almost too white against her overly red lipstick. Tom took a tentative bite, and a metallic tang flooded his mouth. He gagged and dropped his fork, staring at the plate. Embedded in the meatloaf was what looked like a sliver of bone, jagged and yellowed. "What is this?" he demanded, pushing the plate away. Linda's smile didn't falter. "Just the special, Han, made fresh daily." Before Tom could respond, the lights in the diner flickered, and the jukebox sprang to life, playing an old warped tune. The other patrons began to move in unison, standing from their seats with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, their heads tilted to the side as if listening to some unheard command. Tom backed against the booth, his heart pounding. One by one, the diners turned to face him. Their faces were wrong, distorted and slack, with empty eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "What's going on?" Tom stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda leaned in close, her breath cold against his cheek. "You shouldn't have stopped here," she whispered. Her voice was no longer sweet, but guttural, layered with something inhuman. Tom bolted from the booth, knocking over his coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across the table, and for a moment it seemed to writhe, as if alive. He made a dash for the door, but the other patrons closed in, their movements stiff, yet unnervingly fast. The last thing he saw before the world went black was Linda's face twisting into something monstrous, her eyes now black pits, her jaw unhinging impossibly wide to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. Tom's truck was found the next morning, still idling in the parking lot. The diner, however, was gone. In its place was an empty lot overgrown with weeds. Locals say the diner appears only on certain nights, luring in the lost and the desperate. Those who enter never leave. It was a rainy night when Sarah, a young journalist chasing a big story, stumbled upon Benny's diner. She hadn't planned to stop. Her destination was still miles away, but the relentless downpour and flickering headlights of her car left her with no choice. The diner seemed out of place, its neon sign casting an eerie red glow across the soaked asphalt. The words, "Always Open," blinked rhythmically, though the surrounding stretch of road was eerily deserted. Inside, the diner was strangely quiet. The faint hum of a fluorescent light buzzed in the background, and the air carried a faint metallic tang, like rusted pipes or blood. The place was nearly empty, save for a solitary man seated at the counter, and a waitress who was busy wiping down an already spotless surface. Sarah shook off her unease and slid into a corner booth. She noticed immediately that the menus were laminated but sticky, the kind of sticky that made her want to wash her hands immediately. "Coffee?" the waitress asked, appearing out of nowhere. Her name tag read Rose, but the letters were scratched and faded, almost illegible. "Sure, thanks," Sarah said. "Do you have anything warm to eat? Soup, maybe?" Rose's face broke into a strange smile, her lips pale and stretched too wide. "Oh, we've got just the thing, our special chili. It's to die for." The way she said it made Sarah's stomach flip, but she nodded anyway. As the waitress walked back toward the kitchen, Sarah noticed something odd about the man at the counter. He hadn't moved since she arrived. He was hunched over his plate, his fork poised in midair, but he wasn't eating. His head tilted slightly, and for a brief moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw his eyes glint unnaturally, like the reflection of an animal caught in headlights. When the chili arrived, it came in a cracked bowl with a greasy spoon balanced on the edge. The smell was overpowering, a mix of spices and something sour, something wrong. Sarah stirred it cautiously, noticing dark chunks that didn't resemble beans or meat. She tried a small bite. The texture was off, rubbery and tough, and the taste made her gag. Quickly, she spit it back into her napkin, heart pounding. She glanced around, but neither Rose nor the man at the counter seemed to notice. Instead, Rose was staring out the front window, her head cocked unnaturally to the side, as if listening for something far away. Sarah's phone buzzed, startling her. She pulled it out to see a text from an unknown number. "Leave now." Her heart raced as she looked around the room again. The man at the counter had finally moved. Slowly, he turned his head toward her, his neck cracking audibly. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were sunken, their pupils too large for the dim light of the diner. "I wouldn't eat that if I were you," he said in a gravelly voice, though his lips barely moved. Before Sarah could respond, the fluorescent lights began to flicker, plunging the room into alternating moments of brightness and shadow. In one of the flashes, she noticed that Rose was no longer at the window. In the next, she saw her standing in the middle of the room, her body contorted, her head tilted so far back it seemed impossible. Then the lights went out completely. The room was pitch black except for the faint glow of the neon sign outside. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another message. "Run." Her breath caught in her throat as she scrambled to grab her things. A scraping sound echoed through the darkness, followed by a low growl. She turned her phone's flashlight on, the beam slicing through the black. The man at the counter was gone, kept his stool spinning slowly as if he'd just left it. She pointed the light toward the kitchen. The swinging door creaked open, revealing something standing just beyond. Its outline was human, almost, but its arms were too long, its fingers ending in sharp, glistening claws. Its head was cocked unnaturally to the side, and when it opened its mouth, Sarah could hear the faint, wet squelch of flesh being torn. She didn't wait. Sprinting toward the door, she fumbled with the handle, her hands slick with sweat. It wouldn't budge. Behind her, the growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of bare feet slapping against the tiled floor. In a moment of desperation, she threw herself against the glass, shattering it and tumbling onto the wet asphalt. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her hands and knees, and ran toward her car. When she looked back, the diner was gone. No neon sign, no shattered glass, just an empty patch of land where it had stood moments before. The rain had stopped, and the road stretched out before her, silent and dark. As Sarah drove away, her phone buzzed one last time. A final message appeared on the screen. "Next time, don't stop." It was supposed to be a quick pit stop on a road trip to clear their heads, a late-night escape from the city. Claire and her boyfriend Mark were driving through the remote back roads of Appalachia when they spotted it. Gracie's Diner, a squat, old-fashioned building with a flickering neon sign. The words "homemade pies and good company" glowed faintly, inviting and unassuming. "Perfect," Mark said, pulling into the gravel lot. "I'm starving." Claire hesitated. The place looked a little too run down, the kind of establishment that gave you food poisoning or worse. But the growl in her stomach left her little choice. She followed Mark inside, stepping into a room that smelled of stale grease and something earthy, like damp soil. The diner was nearly empty, save for a single waitress and an elderly man sitting at a booth near the back. The man didn't acknowledge them, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, where his hands lay motionless. The waitress greeted them with a slow, mechanical smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, her voice monotone and oddly hollow. Mark chose a booth near the window, but Claire felt exposed and uneasy, as if someone or something was watching. She glanced at the elderly man again. He hadn't moved. "What can I get you folks tonight?" the waitress asked, sliding a grease-stained menu onto their table. "2 coffees and what's the special?" Mark asked. "Meat pie," the waitress replied. Her tone didn't change, but there was something strange in the way her lips twitched, almost like she was suppressing a laugh. Mark shrugged. "I'll take one of those." Claire wrinkled her nose. "Just coffee for me." The waitress nodded and shuffled away, her footsteps oddly heavy for someone so slight. As she disappeared into the kitchen, the air in the diner seemed to shift, growing colder. Claire rubbed her arms, glancing at the elderly man again. "Mark, don't you think it's weird that he hasn't moved?" she whispered. Mark turned to look, but froze. The man wasn't sitting there anymore. His plate was still on the table, untouched, but the booth was empty. Claire's heart skipped. Where did he go? "I didn't see him leave," Mark admitted, unease creeping into his voice. Before they could speculate further, the waitress returned, balancing a steaming plate and 2 cups of coffee. She set the meat pie in front of Mark and the coffee in front of both of them. Her gaze lingered on Claire for a moment, her hollow eyes narrowing slightly, before she turned and retreated to the kitchen without another word. Mark dug into the pie, oblivious to Claire's growing discomfort. She watched as he took a bite, his face lighting up. "This is amazing," he said, his voice muffled around a mouthful. "You sure you don't want any?" Claire shook her head, her eyes drifting to the coffee in front of her. The liquid inside was thick and dark, with an oily sheen that didn't look right. She pushed it away. "Something's wrong with this place," she whispered. "We should leave." Mark rolled his eyes but didn't argue, finishing the last of his pie in record time. As he reached for his coffee, his hand stopped midway. His eyes glazed over and his body tensed. "Mark?" Claire asked, panic rising. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. His head jerked to the side, his neck cracking audibly. When he turned back to her, his eyes were wrong, cloudy and unfocused, as if he were looking through her instead of at her. "Mark?" she repeated, her voice trembling. Suddenly he grinned, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, revealing teeth smeared with bits of meat and something dark. His voice when he spoke was not his own. It was layered, deep, and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here." Claire scrambled out of the booth, her pulse pounding in her ears. Mark stood slowly, his movements jerky, almost puppet-like. His head twitched and his grin widened further as he took a step toward her. The lights flickered violently, and a low growl echoed from the kitchen. The waitress emerged, but she wasn't the same. Her eyes were gone, replaced by gaping black voids that seemed to suck in the dim light. Her fingers stretched unnaturally long, that ending in sharp, claw-like tips. Claire bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She turned to see Mark and the waitress advancing on her, their movements eerily synchronized. From the back of the diner came more figures, shadowy shapes that seemed to materialize out of the walls. Desperate, Claire grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered, and she climbed through, cutting her hands on the shards. She ran to the car, fumbling with the keys, and started the engine just as the figures reached the window, their blank, hollow faces pressing against the glass. She didn't look back as she sped down the road, her heart hammering in her chest. When she finally dared to glance in the rearview mirror, the diner was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. The next day, she called the police, but they found nothing. No diner, no waitress, no Mark. Just her bloodied car and a patch of dirt where Gracie's diner had supposedly stood. To this day, Claire avoids back roads and diners, but sometimes late at night, she swears she hears Mark's voice on the wind, whispering, "You shouldn't have come here." It was close to midnight when Jason pulled into the parking lot of Molly's diner. His shift at the warehouse had run late, and the thought of going home to cook something was unbearable. The diner sat at the edge of a lonely highway, its flickering sign barely illuminating the cracked pavement. He'd passed the place dozens of times, but had never gone inside. Tonight, it seemed like the only option. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped in. The interior was almost unnervingly pristine. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, the countertops gleamed, and the air smelled faintly of lemons and something else, something faintly metallic. A waitress appeared seemingly out of nowhere, her uniform crisp, her smile painted on like a doll's. "Late night?" she asked, handing him a menu. "Yeah," Jason said, sitting at the counter. He didn't even glance at the menu. "Just coffee and a burger, please." "Coming right up." She turned, disappearing into the kitchen without another word. Jason took in the diner as he waited. It was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the neon sign outside. Two other patrons sat at opposite ends of the room. One was a man in a gray suit staring intently at the tabletop. The other was a woman in a floral dress who appeared to be crying. Her shoulders shook, but no sound came from her. Jason shifted uncomfortably. "You okay, miss?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even look up. The man in the suit slowly turned his head toward Jason, his face expressionless, his eyes glassy. Jason looked away quickly, the hair on his arms standing on end. The waitress returned with his coffee and a steaming plate of food. The burger looked fine, perfect even, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The smell. It was too strong, too rich, like raw meat that had been left out too long. "Need anything else?" the waitress asked, her smile frozen in place. "No, I'm good," Jason muttered, forcing himself to take a bite. The meat was juicy, but the texture was strange, gritty and stringy. He swallowed hard, his stomach turning, and decided the fries would have to suffice. As he ate, the crying woman suddenly stood up, her movements stiff and unnatural. She turned toward Jason, her head tilting at an odd angle. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and her lips were moving soundlessly. Jason froze. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer, her bare feet slapping against the tiled floor. Jason noticed they left faint, dark smudges, as if she were walking through something wet. He glanced at the man in the suit, hoping for some kind of intervention, but the man was gone. His booth was empty, the chair still slightly rocking. Jason's heartbeat thundered in his ears as the woman drew nearer. Her lips moved faster now, forming words he couldn't hear. Her eyes locked onto his, and suddenly her mouth opened wide. Too wide. A guttural scream tore from her throat, echoing through the empty diner. Jason stumbled back, knocking over his plate and coffee. The waitress appeared behind the counter, but her smile was gone. Her smile was gone. Her face was blank, her eyes black pits. "You shouldn't have eaten," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. It was layered, deep, and otherworldly. "What the hell is this?" Jason shouted, backing toward the door. The woman lunged at him, her fingers clawing at the air. Jason turned and ran, slamming into the door. It wouldn't budge. He pounded on the glass, but it was as though the diner itself wouldn't let him leave. "Sit down," the waitress said, her voice calm but commanding. "Finish your meal." Jason spun around, his back to the door. The crying woman was no longer alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their faces slack and lifeless. Some crawled, their limbs bending at unnatural angles, while others shuffled forward, their heads twitching like marionettes on strings. He reached for a chair and swung it wildly, keeping the advancing figures at bay. His eyes darted to the windows, hoping for a way out, but the view outside had changed. The parking lot was gone. Instead, a swirling black void surrounded the diner, pressing against the glass like a living thing. "You shouldn't have come here," the waitress repeated, her voice echoing unnaturally. Jason's breath came in short gasps as the crowd closed in. The crying woman was in front now, her face inches from his. Her lips twisted into a grotesque smile, and her whisper finally became audible. "You're one of us now." Jason screamed as her hands latched onto his shoulders, pulling him into the crowd of shambling figures. The last thing he saw was the waitress watching with that painted-on smile as the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, a trucker passing through found the diner exactly as it had been, quiet, pristine, and empty. The only sign of life was the faint buzz of the neon sign and a single burger sitting untouched on the counter. It was nearly 1 a.m. when Emma spotted the glowing sign for Ray's 24-hour grill. She'd been driving for hours through a seemingly endless stretch of back roads, her GPS glitching out, leaving her hopelessly lost. The sign was like a beacon, a promise of food, coffee, and a break from the oppressive silence of the empty road. The parking lot was empty save for her own car. The diner stood alone in the middle of nowhere, its fluorescent lights casting an unnatural glow that made the surrounding darkness seem deeper. Still, Emma was too hungry and exhausted to care. She pushed the door open, and the familiar jingle of a bell greeted her. Inside, the place was eerily immaculate. The smell of bleach hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of stale grease. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back to Emma, methodically scrubbing a plate. Her movements were slow and repetitive, as if she'd been doing it for hours. "Take a seat anywhere," the waitress said without turning around, her voice flat and devoid of energy. Emma chose a booth by the window, though all she could see outside was her own reflection and the void of night beyond it. A laminated menu was already on the table, though the edges were frayed and the text seemed oddly faded. When the waitress finally approached, Emma couldn't help but feel uneasy. Her face was pale, her expression blank, and her uniform spotless to the point of sterility. Her name tag read Cora, but the letters were scuffed, almost illegible. "What'll it be?" Cora asked, her tone as lifeless as her stare. Just coffee and maybe some pancakes," Emma said, trying not to sound as unnerved as she felt. Cora nodded without writing anything down and shuffled back toward the kitchen. Emma watched her go, noticing how her feet didn't quite leave the floor, like she was dragging herself along. While she waited, Emma's eyes wandered around the diner. The clock on the wall was stuck at 12:17, its second hand twitching but never advancing. The jukebox in the corner was silent, though its lights flickered faintly as if struggling to come alive. And then there were the patrons, or rather, lack thereof. Not a single other person was in the diner. For a place open 24/7, it felt disturbingly empty. Her coffee arrived first, steaming in a chipped mug. Emma hesitated before taking a sip. It tasted bitter and metallic, like the water had come from rusted pipes. She set it down, grimacing. Cora returned moments later with a plate of pancakes. They looked fine, perfectly round and golden, but the smell was off. Emma couldn't quite place it, but it reminded her of damp earth, like something freshly dug up. "You need anything else?" Cora asked, her voice startling Emma. "No, this is fine," she replied, forcing a smile. Cora stared at her for a moment too long before shuffling away again, back to her endless task of scrubbing plates. Emma cut into the pancakes, her stomach growling despite her unease. As she lifted the first bite to her mouth, she noticed something embedded in the syrup, a dark strand. She pulled it free, her heart skipping when she realized it was a hair. No, not a hair, something coarser. A fiber? A thread? Her appetite vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. She pushed the plate away and stood up, intending to leave. But as she turned toward the door, she froze. There was someone sitting in the booth across from hers. She hadn't heard anyone come in. The figure was slouched forward, their face obscured by shadow. Their clothes were old and torn, their skin grayish and mottled. Emma's mouth went dry. "Hello," she called out hesitantly. The figure didn't move. But then, slowly, their head turned. Empty sockets stared back at her where eyes should have been, and their jaw hung open unnaturally wide, as if it had been unhinged. Emma stumbled backward, knocking over her coffee mug. The sound shattered the silence, and in an instant the entire diner seemed to come alive. The clock began ticking loudly, though its hands still didn't move. The jukebox blared to life, but the song was warped, a distorted, scratchy tune that made her ears ache. She turned to the counter, hoping to yell for Cora, but the waitress was no longer there. In her place stood another figure, identical to the one in the booth, gray-skinned, eyeless, and slack-jawed. Emma bolted for the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. She yanked on it desperately, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, she could hear the shuffle of feet, slow at first, then faster. She turned and screamed. The diner was full now. Figures filled every booth, every stool, their eyeless faces all turned toward her. They began to rise, moving in unison, their heads tilting unnaturally as they shuffled closer. "Stay," a voice whispered, though it came from everywhere at once. "Eat. You're one of us now." Emma's scream was cut short as the lights in the diner flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. The next morning, a state trooper driving along the highway noticed a car parked in front of an abandoned lot. There was no diner, just an overgrown patch of land. The car belonged to Emma. Inside, they found her wallet, phone, and a half-empty cup of coffee. But of Emma herself, there was no trace. Locals say Ray's 24-hour grill hasn't existed in decades, though it occasionally reappears for those who are lost and desperate. But those who enter are never seen again. On a bitterly cold night, Ethan found himself driving through the desolate backroads of the Midwest. His GPS had led him astray, leaving him navigating a labyrinth of dark, empty highways. His gas tank was nearing empty, and his stomach growled with hunger. When a flickering neon sign reading "Sammy's Diner, open all night" appeared in the distance, he felt a surge of relief. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, but Ethan didn't care. He pulled in and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the frosted gravel. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and rotting leaves. The diner's windows were fogged, obscuring the view inside, but the faint glow of the interior lights was welcoming enough. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the first thing Ethan noticed was the heat. It was stiflingly warm, a stark contrast to the icy night outside. The second thing he noticed was the silence. There was no music playing, no chatter, not even the hum of appliances. A single waitress stood behind the counter, her back to him. Her uniform was old-fashioned, like something out of the 1950s, and her movements were slow and deliberate as she wiped down an already spotless counter. Ethan took a seat at a booth near the center of the diner. He glanced around, expecting to see other late-night travelers, but the place was empty. The waitress approached, holding a menu she didn't bother to offer. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice low and almost mechanical. "Just coffee to start," Ethan replied. The waitress nodded and shuffled off, her footsteps unnervingly heavy. Ethan watched her go, his unease growing. The diner felt wrong. The walls seemed too close, the air too still, as though the building itself were holding its breath. His coffee arrived moments later, steaming in a chipped mug. The liquid was darker than any coffee he'd ever seen, its surface almost viscous. Ethan hesitated but took a sip. The taste was bitter and strangely metallic, but it did the job of warming him up. The waitress lingered, her empty gaze fixed on him. "Anything else?" Yeah, a cheeseburger and fries, I guess." She nodded and walked back to the kitchen, her movements stiff and robotic. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the other booths. Something about the place was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. And then he saw it. At the far corner booth, a figure sat slumped over the table. Their head was tilted at an unnatural angle as though their neck were broken. Ethan blinked, his heart racing. He could have sworn that booth had been empty when he came in. "Hey," he called out. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. Ethan stood, his curiosity overpowering his fear. As he approached the booth, the smell hit him, an acrid, sickly sweet odor that made his stomach churn. When he got close enough to see the figure's face, he froze. It wasn't a person, not anymore. The thing's skin was waxy and pale, its lips peeled back to reveal blackened teeth. Its eyes were open but lifeless, staring at nothing. The body jerked suddenly, its head twitching toward Ethan. "You shouldn't be here," it rasped, its voice guttural and wet. Ethan stumbled back, his legs nearly giving out. He turned to run, but the diner had changed. The booths were now filled with motionless figures, all slumped over in unnatural poses, their faces obscured by shadows. The waitress stood at the counter, her blank expression replaced by a wide, predatory grin. "You ordered the special," she said, her voice layered with something inhuman. Ethan bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but his voice seemed swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Behind him, the figures began to rise, their movements jerky and wrong. They turned toward him, their lifeless eyes fixed on his. The waitress laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the confined space. "Nobody leaves Sammy's, sweetheart. Not after they've been served." The last thing Ethan saw was the mob of figures closing in on him, their twisted limbs reaching out, and the waitress's grin widening impossibly as the lights in the diner flickered and died. A week later, a passing trucker noticed an abandoned car sitting in front of a dilapidated building. The diner was little more than a crumbling ruin, its sign barely legible under years of grime and neglect. Curious, the trucker peeked inside. The tables were covered in dust, the air thick with decay, but at the counter sat a single plate, a cold cheeseburger and a mug of black coffee. It was a stormy night when Rebecca found herself hopelessly lost on an unfamiliar stretch of road. Her phone's GPS refused to load, and the rain pounded against her windshield with such force that she could barely see a foot ahead. Just as she was considering pulling over, a neon sign flickered to life in the distance. Edith's Diner, always open. Desperate for warmth and a break from the storm, Rebecca turned into the diner's gravel lot. The place seemed to materialize out of nowhere. standing solitary amid the darkness. The parking lot was empty, save for an old rusted truck that looked like it hadn't moved in decades. Inside, the diner was oddly warm and inviting. A faint smell of frying bacon and coffee filled the air, and soft 1950s music played from a jukebox in the corner. The walls were decorated with faded photos of smiling patrons, all dated decades earlier. Rebecca's unease subsided slightly as she approached the counter, her boots squeaking against the linoleum floor. A woman in a vintage waitress uniform appeared from the kitchen. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, and her lipstick was a shade too bright, but her smile was kind. "Rough night?" she asked, sliding a menu across the counter. "You have no idea," Rebecca replied, managing a nervous chuckle. "Coffee, please, and maybe a slice of pie?" "Coming right up," the waitress said, her tone chipper but oddly rehearsed. Her name tag read Edith. Rebecca settled into a booth by the window, though the storm outside obscured any view. She tried to shake off the odd vibe of the place, telling herself it was just her nerves from the storm. When Edith returned with a steaming mug and a plate of pie, Rebecca noticed something strange. The pie looked perfect. Too perfect. The crust was golden and symmetrical, the filling glistening under the lights like something out of a commercial. "Best pie in the county," Edith said, as if reading her thoughts. Rebecca took a cautious bite. It was delicious, sweet, tangy, and rich, but there was a faint metallic aftertaste that made her stomach turn. She pushed the plate aside after just one bite, suddenly not feeling as hungry as she thought. "Not a fan?" Edith asked, her smile never faltering. "It's good," Rebecca said quickly, not wanting to offend. "I guess I'm just more tired than hungry." Edith nodded, though her eyes lingered on Rebecca a moment too long. "You let me know if you need anything else." As Edith returned to the kitchen, Rebecca's eyes wandered to the photos on the walls. Something about them seemed off. The people in the photos, all wearing outdated clothing, looked eerily similar to the customers she could see reflected faintly in the glossy surface of the booth's table. Except the diner was empty. Rebecca's stomach tightened as she turned to scan the room again. No one was there, yet the reflections remained, shadowy figures sitting in booths, sipping coffee and eating meals. She blinked, her heart pounding, but the reflections stayed. Her breath hitched as one of the reflected figures turned, locking its hollow black eyes on hers. Rebecca shot up from her seat, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The jukebox music warped, slowing to a distorted crawl. From behind the counter, Edith appeared again, her cheerful smile now stretched unnaturally wide. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice layered with an unsettling echo. Rebecca didn't respond. She bolted for the door, her boots slipping on the slick floor. When she yanked on the handle, it wouldn't budge. She turned back, panic rising, and froze. The diner was no longer empty. Every booth, every stool, was filled with the shadowy figures she'd seen in the reflections. They stared at her with eyeless faces, their movements jerky and disjointed as they turned to face her. "You can't leave," Edith said, stepping out from behind the counter. Her body moved unnaturally, her limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. "You're part of the diner now," Rebecca screamed, slamming her fists against the door. The shadowy figures began to rise, their bodies flickering like static on a broken TV. One by one, they shuffled toward her, their hollow eyes fixed on her as their mouths opened in silent screams. The lights flickered violently, and in an instant, the diner was plunged into darkness. Rebecca felt cold, clammy hands grabbing her shoulders, pulling her back into the suffocating void. Weeks later, a passing motorist stopped when they noticed a rusted car sitting in the diner's parking lot. But when they stepped inside, the diner was empty, its walls coated in years of dust and decay. On the counter, they found a fresh plate of pie, still warm. A faded photograph hung on the wall nearby depicting a young woman sitting in a booth by the window. Her face was unmistakably Rebecca's. The rain was coming down in relentless sheets when Mark's car sputtered and died on a forgotten stretch of highway. Cursing his luck, he pulled his coat tighter and ventured out into the storm, desperate to find help. The only light came from a flickering neon sign in the distance. Betty's Diner, open all night. The diner was the only building for miles, its parking lot barren save for a single vintage car that looked like it hadn't moved since the 1960s. Mark hurried inside, grateful to escape the cold. A bell chimed as he pushed open the door. Inside, the diner was eerily pristine, as though it had been frozen in time. Red vinyl booths, a chrome counter, and a jukebox glowing faintly in the corner gave it a retro charm. Yet the place was silent. No music, no conversation, just the muffled sound of rain pounding against the windows. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back to Mark. Her blonde curls were pinned up neatly, and her uniform was pressed and spotless. When she turned, her smile was a little too perfect, her teeth unnervingly white. "Welcome to Betty's," she said in a syrupy tone. "Take a seat anywhere." Mark chose a booth near the door, glancing around for other patrons. The place was empty. The waitress appeared moments later holding a menu. Her name tag read, "Betty." "What'll it be?" she asked, her smile unwavering. Just coffee and a burger, I guess," Mark replied, trying not to let his unease show. "Coming right up." Betty turned on her heel and vanished into the kitchen. Mark glanced toward the jukebox. It wasn't playing, but the lights on it pulsed faintly, almost as if they were breathing. His gaze drifted to the photos on the walls, black and white snapshots of smiling families, laughing couples, and groups of friends. But something about the photos gave him pause. The faces were too similar, as if the same group of people had been photographed over and over in slightly different poses and clothes. Before he could think too much about it, Betty returned with his coffee. The steaming mug was chipped, and the liquid inside was darker than it should have been. Mark took a cautious sip and immediately regretted it. The taste was bitter, metallic, and wrong, like old pennies. He pushed it aside and resolved to wait for his food. Minutes passed, and the storm outside grew louder, almost deafening. Mark tapped his fingers against the table, his impatience growing. He glanced toward the kitchen, hoping to see some sign of Betty, but instead, he noticed movement in the corner of his eye. The jukebox lights were flashing erratically now, casting strange shadows across the room. He turned to look and froze. A man sat in the booth across from him. Mark hadn't heard anyone come in. The man was dressed in a suit that looked decades old, and his face was pale and slack, like a mannequin's. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his glassy eyes stared directly at Mark. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. Mark blinked, and suddenly the booth was empty. His stomach dropped, his heartbeat quickening. He grabbed his jacket and stood, deciding it was time to leave. But as he turned toward the door, his path was blocked. Betty stood there, her smile wider than before, her eyes unnaturally bright. "You haven't finished your meal," she said, her voice slightly distorted as though layered with static. "I need to go," Mark stammered, trying to sidestep her. But the door wouldn't open, no matter how hard he pulled. He looked back over his shoulder and his blood ran cold. The diner was no longer empty. Every booth was now occupied by shadowy figures, their heads twisted at odd angles, their lifeless eyes fixed on him. Betty stepped closer, her smile splitting her face unnaturally wide. "You're our guest, Mark. You can't leave." "How do you know my name?" he demanded, backing away from her. "You belong here now," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Behind her, the figures began to rise, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes on tangled strings. They shuffled toward him, their hollow faces contorted in grotesque expressions. Mark screamed. Throwing himself against the door, it wouldn't budge. The figures were closing in, their twisted limbs reaching for him. The jukebox blared to life, its music distorted and warped, drowning out his cries. As the lights in the diner flickered and died, the last thing Mark saw was Betty's face inches from his, her unblinking eyes boring into his own. The next morning, a state trooper found Mark's car abandoned on the side of the road. There was no sign of him, but a crumpled diner receipt lay on the passenger seat. It read, "Betty's Diner, table for one, paid in full." Locals say Betty's Diner hasn't existed in years, but every now and then someone claims to see its neon sign glowing faintly in the distance. No one who goes inside is ever seen again. The night was eerily quiet when Sarah stumbled across Jake's roadside diner. She'd been driving for hours, lost on winding back roads after taking a wrong turn. Her gas tank was dangerously low, and her nerves were frayed. The glowing sign felt like salvation. Jake's Diner. Good food, open late. The parking lot was empty except for a single car, a dusty sedan with plates too faded to read. Sarah parked her car and hurried inside, shivering against the chilly autumn air. The interior was quaint but unnervingly old-fashioned. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and the counter gleamed under fluorescent lights. A faint smell of coffee and frying bacon hung in the air, but there was no sound, no chatter, no clatter of plates, just a suffocating silence. A man stood behind the counter, his back to her. He wore a grease-stained apron, his hands busily scrubbing a glass that already looked spotless. Without turning, he called out in a gruff voice, "Sit anywhere you like." Sarah chose a booth near the center of the room, the squeak of the vinyl echoing too loudly in the quiet. She glanced toward the man, expecting him to turn and greet her, but he continued his silent scrubbing. Moments later, he finally approached, sliding a laminated menu onto the table. His face was gaunt, his skin sallow under the harsh lights. His name tag read, "Jake." "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice flat. Sarah hesitated, unnerved by his sunken eyes and the hollow tone of his voice. Just coffee and a BLT, I guess?" Jake nodded and shuffled back toward the kitchen. Sarah watched him go, noting how his shoulders hunched unnaturally, as if the weight of the world bore down on him. She sipped the water he'd brought her, but it tasted faintly of mildew. Her eyes wandered to the walls, which were decorated with black and white photos of the diner's supposed glory days. The people in the pictures all looked cheerful, laughing and posing with plates of food. But as Sarah squinted, something about the photos felt wrong. The smiles were too wide, the eyes were too blank, and the longer she stared, the more it seemed as though the faces were turning, their empty gazes shifting toward her. She tore her eyes away, her pulse quickening. When Jake returned with her coffee, his movements were slower, as if he were reluctant to approach. "You okay?" she asked, hoping to shake the growing tension. Jake didn't answer right away. He placed the coffee on the table, his hand trembling slightly. "Eat quick," he muttered, almost too softly to hear. "Don't stay long." Before she could ask what he meant, he shuffled back to the kitchen, leaving her alone again. The coffee was bitter and acrid, but Sarah forced down a few sips, hoping the caffeine would help her focus. Minutes passed, and her BLT never arrived. Sarah glanced toward the kitchen, but Jake was nowhere to be seen. The silence pressed against her, growing heavier with each passing second. Then she noticed it. The other booths weren't empty anymore. Shadowy figures sat slumped at the tables, their heads bowed as if sleeping. Their clothes were old and tattered, their hair matted and unkempt. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as one of them twitched, a slow, jerky movement that sent chills down her spine. She stood abruptly, knocking over her coffee. The clatter broke the silence, and all at once the figures began to stir. Heads lifted, faces turned, their eyes, black, sunken pits, locked onto hers. Sarah bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. She yanked on the handle, panic rising as the figures began to stand, their movements unnatural and stiff. A low, guttural sound filled the air, like the groaning of wood under pressure. "Help!" she screamed, pounding on the glass. "Leave her alone." Jake's voice cut through the air, rough and desperate. She turned to see him standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a large knife. His hands shook, and his gaunt face was etched with terror. The shadowy figures turned their attention to him, their black eyes narrowing. "You can't have her!" Jake shouted, stepping forward. She doesn't belong here." The figures surged toward him, their twisted limbs reaching out. Jake lunged, swinging the knife wildly, but they overwhelmed him in seconds. Sarah watched in horror as he disappeared beneath a writhing mass of shadow and limbs. The distraction was enough. Sarah turned back to the door, and this time it flew open. She sprinted to her car, fumbling with the keys as the shadowy figures began spilling out of the diner, their distorted shapes moving unnaturally fast. The engine roared to life, and she sped away, not daring to look back. When she reached the next town, Sarah stumbled into a gas station and begged the attendant to call the police. But when the authorities arrived at the location she described, there was no diner. Just an overgrown lot with a rusted sedan sitting among the weeds. Later, Sarah learned that Jake's roadside diner had burned down decades ago, the result of a grease fire that killed its owner and several patrons. But some say the diner still appears on stormy nights, drawing in lost travelers who are never seen again.